anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today on the Monday edition of Point of View. Here's a headline you didn't think we'd see anytime soon, but I'm glad that we do. The last living hostages return to Israel. In just a few minutes, we'll talk about the peace process, what's happening in the Middle East, and try to give you some perspective on that. We have posted a number of articles about that, which I think you're going to find helpful, and we'll probably even be discussing it again tomorrow. But first of all, we were privileged to be able to score an interview with Lawrence Jones. Now, if you watch Fox News at all, you know who he is, the co-host of Fox News channel Fox and Friends, an individual that previously served as the host of the Lawrence Jones Cross Country. And I might just mention, we have posted a couple things. First, an article that comes from the Dallas Morning News that came out 2 years ago after he'd spent the first full year there at Fox News. We also have some information about Texas Tuesday, and there's a great connection there because we broadcast in this studio from Dallas, but if you go out the door and go on to LBJ Freeway to the east, you're right into Garland, which was his hometown. So we're going to be talking about some of that. And Lawrence Jones, welcome to Point of View.
Hey there. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, an individual growing up in Texas, and now certainly an individual that I would imagine most of our listeners know. There have got to be days in which you say, this has been really a great first gig and first couple of gigs, and you, as I understand, are one of the youngest in cable news, so you got many years ahead of you.
I mean, I've been quite fortunate, been doing this since I was about 19 years old, and now I'm 32, about to be 33, and truly just a blessed life. Didn't have it all growing up, but now I have the opportunity to broadcast every single day about issues that matter to our audience, and it's a humbling experience.
Well, let me just for just a minute encourage our listeners to go to our website, because one of the things we've done is posted that article from the Dallas Morning News. Although we're broadcasting from Dallas and we have a number of listeners in Texas, we're broadcasting in about 30 some odd states. So a lot of people might not even know much about your upbringing in Garland and your success. But talk about that. And then I just want to briefly get into the Texas Tuesday that you've implemented as well. Can you give us some background?
Yeah, as far as growing up, part of my life, my mom got pregnant with me when she was 16, had me at 17. My dad married her, and we spent most of our time starting in Dallas. When we were growing up, we didn't have very much, and my parents wanted us to have quality schools. And Garland, Texas is one of those towns that has choice of schools, not school choice, but choice of schools. Meaning you can live anywhere, whether it's a poor neighborhood or a wealthier neighborhood in Garland, and you can choose what school you want to go to, any school. So we moved to Garland, and, really just like any other American family, I'm the oldest of three, and just pushed through things. And my parents were made it very clear, excellence is what they required. My dad didn't tolerate mediocrity, and my mom was the face pusher within our household. And, those philosophies gelled together got me here very early.
Well, again, one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this is we also have a link to X, and it shows some of the co-hosts that you have. They got Ainsley with cowboy boots. Of course, we would expect you to be wearing cowboy boots, but you've sort of converted some of the people on air to actually dress the way you've been able to dress in the state of Texas.
Yeah. So, I miss home so much. I still have a house in Texas. Try to get back every other week. And, I was in a makeup chair one time and talking about, I just want to bring some of Texas to the show. And, one of the ladies within in our department said, it needs to be something that is, Texas that everybody can. I was like, well, I could wear my cowboy boots. She goes, that's it, Texas Tuesday. I'm like, yeah, that's what I like. So every Tuesday I wear my cowboy boots. And the audience will send pictures in. Now, of course, I wear them more days, but I make sure on Tuesday that's the one day of the week that I actually do it. And it gives, our co-host the opportunity to participate. Ainsley knows a lot about it because she's from the South. Brian's from New York. So although he participated one time, we got him fitted for the cowboy boots, but it's just not his thing. But the audience, they send in their photos every week.
Yes. Well, I might just mention, too, that tomorrow's Texas Tuesday, and there's a place for viewers to submit various things, celebrations, and the rest. And so, again, I wanted people to know about that. And, again, if they would like to know more about you, it is always fascinating to know the backstory, and yours is quite fascinating. Before you ended up at Fox, we have that article in the Dallas News. Of course, I have this link to the Instagram piece and a couple of other pieces on X, so you can find some of that on our website, pointofview.net. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, Lawrence, today, because we are going to be talking about the fact that this is, some people think, the most significant day so far in the Trump administration with the release of the hostages. I suspect you will be and have already been talking about that on Fox and Friends.
Yeah, today is just it is a deeply emotional day. We started broadcasting early today at 5 a.m. and, we were on eggshells because we said, is Hamas really going to keep their word? We know our commander-in-chief and is tough and, he has great precision and timing, but are they going to keep their word? And I tell you, when we got the news that all the hostages had in fact been released, man, the jubilation not only within our studio but all our friends around in Israel, and it is one part, significant part to getting peace in the Middle East. And I think there's only one person that could have done it, and that's the President of the United States. I had the opportunity to talk to him before he boarded Air Force One to Egypt, and he said this accomplishment, he obviously he wants to do more, but if he doesn't accomplish anything else, he feels like this moment was enough for him. And you could, knowing him for a while, you could see the humility in that moment.
Yeah.
He of course, he's the president. He's our commander-in-chief. There's a lot of issues pressing America today, but he was very still today.
Yes. Well, Lawrence, we love watching you on television. I appreciate you giving us a few minutes today. And if nothing else, when we come back after the break, we're going to spend some time talking about what happened behind the scenes. And a pleasure to have you. And next time you're in Texas, I'd love to get you in the studio. We could chat as well. But thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. A pleasure. Thank you so much.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot to cover. I'll do my best in the time we have allotted, but you will see we do have a very good piece on we're a long way from October 6th. You think? That's one of the reasons why we have what could be peace in the Middle East. We'll see. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Americans are starting to realize how much privacy they are losing. It isn't just the government through surveillance that is invading our privacy. Major corporations are collecting information on us, even when we aren't sharing it online. Here's a classic example of that. 20 years ago, the Target Corporation was able to conclude that a shopper was pregnant and even estimate her due date. The story was written up in the New York Times and has become a classic example of targeted marketing. A data scientist at Target began to analyze this massive database that Target stores were amassing from the purchases of their customers. He began to mine the data and discovered a few interesting things about Target customers. He discovered, for example, that pregnant women are more likely to buy unscented lotion and that they start doing this at the beginning of their second trimester. This correlation between pregnancy and changes in shopping behavior was one of the 24 data points he and other analysts were able to identify. When they combined all these correlations together, they were able to establish a pregnancy prediction score. This score told them two things. First, that the female consumer was pregnant. Second, it also gave them a good estimate of her due date. The value to Target was considerable. They were able to send coupons to the woman during different times in her pregnancy so that they would arrive when she was most likely to need them. The timing of the coupons brought more pregnant women into the Target stores to use them. You know, this marketing success story illustrates how big data and sophisticated data analysis can invade your privacy without you providing any information. Whether you click on a link online or buy a product in the store, somebody is watching. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Monday edition of Point of View. And first of all, let me do what I would have normally done at the very beginning. But since we only had a short time with Lawrence Jones of Fox News, I do want to say thank you to those who actually sat in this chair last week. And that is, of course, Liberty McCarter, as well as Merrill Matthews and Chelsea Uman. And so, again, they were covering while I was out teaching. And we are back, of course, talking about what is a very significant day in the Middle East, a very significant day in the Trump administration. And again, a headline that we hoped we'd be able to see, but now actually, again, the last living hostages returned to Israel. In addition to those, about 24 hostages who are deceased. Some of the dead were murdered by Hamas on October 7th, and then the bodies just dragged into Gaza for that time. Others were murdered in captivity. And you have to understand the significance not only here in the United States, but especially in Israel. We had Lawrence talk about chatting briefly with the president as he was in Israel and is now in Egypt, which is where the peace accords are actually going to be signed and ratified. But interestingly enough, the opposition leader, Yair Lapid, who is in the Knesset, and he's really the opposition leader, nevertheless addressed the president and thanked him for what he had done. He said, "Mr. President, you have saved the lives of our hostages. You've saved so much more. You have saved the souls of the bereaved whose loved ones now will be brought home for burial. You have saved thousands of soldiers who will not fall in battle. You have saved millions from the horrors of war. You have saved far more than one life, and each life is an entire world." Goes on to a little bit later, said, "When you were elected, you declared that you would be the president of peace." You think? If you're keeping track, some people say these are 8 wars the president has been able to bring peace to. That may be a slight overcount, but nevertheless, it's an illustration of some of the conflicts that exist. Of course, we still have Ukraine and Russia. We'll get to that in due course. But he says, "You have kept your word. The fact that you were not awarded the Peace Prize is a grave mistake by the committee, but they will have no choice," he says, interestingly enough, that they will award it to you next year. well, I'm not holding my breath, but if you're not familiar, the Nobel Peace Prize this year went to Maria Corina Machado, and she is an individual that has been fighting for democracy in Venezuela, and she actually praised President Donald Trump for his support in her fight there, and seemed to even imply that maybe he was as deserving or maybe even more so than her. But nevertheless, that's where we find ourselves right now. And to be fair, some of us have been a little bit critical of some of the envoys that have tried to bring about some of these changes. Steve Witkoff, of course, we can give him high praise for having bringing home the American who was in a Russian prison, but some people wondered whether or not whether an individual like Steve Witkoff and, of course, also Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, might have been up to the task. Well, they were. And I found this particular story last Friday when Jared Kushner heard that Hamas would begin talks to release Israeli hostages. He was fielding calls at his mansion, which sits on an island there north of Miami. He jumped in his car, drove 20 minutes to another mansion, this one owned by the billionaire Steve Witkoff, who is the Middle East peace envoy, and they began to put together what is, of course, now fait accompli. That is a peace process. Now, again, let's also be very honest. I found this piece here. I think Hamas has been willing to make a deal to release the hostages, but in return for some kind of assurance that the war would actually end. And yet we have to also recognize that this is not an organization, Hamas, known for keeping its word. They broke ceasefires with Israel in 2003, 2007, 2008, 9 times in 2014. So nobody naively thinks that this is going to be the end, but it could be with various kinds of peacekeeping troops there, which, again, I'll get to in just a minute, are not necessarily going to be American boots on the ground, could be enough. One of the arguments that is being made, and of course you'll see this in this first article by Noah Rothman, but others have pointed out as well, nothing like an Israeli airstrike against Hamas leaders in Qatar, which happened on September 9th, to remind them that we will find you, even if you're not in the Gaza Strip, we will find you. And as a result, that I think has been kind of a very powerful statement indeed. Which brings me to our first article, apart from the ones we just posted from Lawrence Jones. This one by Noah Rothman says we're a long way from October 6th, because you can remind yourself of what we were like on October 6th. This would be the day before that particular action by Hamas took place. And as a result, at that time, Israel was surrounded by what many of the people in Iran had referred to as a ring of fire. In other words, this sort of axis of resistance, which include Hamas, Hezbollah, even the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, not to mention, of course, the threat from Iran itself. Well, what has happened since then? Well, these outfits, according to Noah Rothman, and I would agree, have been decimated by the work of Israelis and their Western partners, the United States in particular. Hamas is a leaderless shadow of its former self. Hezbollah following conventional and spectacularly impressive unconventional attacks on the leadership. That again was pagers blowing up in their hands or faces. And then with Tehran and Iran itself, Iran's nuclear program was, first of all, pretty much decimated above ground by Israel, and then decimated below ground by the United States by Operation Midnight Hammer. And so as a result, what you are starting to see now is something that is maybe reminiscent of what we saw with the Abraham Accords, because even if the peace deal that Donald Trump secured between Israel and Hamas's negotiators falls apart in later stages, you now at least have the backing of many in the very significant Muslim world. This article by Noah Rothman points out that you have Muslim governments as diverse as those as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, who are committed to support a document insisting that Hamas cannot actually rule the Strip. And so there's certainly some concerns there as well. One of those concerns you might see is the fact that we would hope that Hamas would be obedient to what was actually in the document. But the bottom line is we know that it probably will not. And what I think is so interesting is that there is probably going to be a need to try to find some other ways to address these issues. And it is item number 13, which says that Hamas is no longer going to be in control of the Gaza Strip. And so if indeed that can be maintained with various peacekeeping outfits, which could be everything from the United Nations to Israel, that would avoid us having boots on the ground. I'm going to say more about that in just a few minutes, but I thought I might also mention one of the more interesting illustrations of why maybe you want to be listening to Point of View and not the mainstream press. Because with all of this going on, Vice President J.D. Vance actually came on ABC with George Stephanopoulos. And what did they talk about? Peace in the Middle East? No, they didn't talk about that. China threatening critical supply chains? Well, no, actually, there's some real issues that I'm going to probably have to talk about tomorrow in that regard. Oh, the government shutdown? No, they didn't talk about that. They spent the whole time dealing with what I think most people believe is a fake scandal involving Tom Homan. And interestingly enough, Vice President Vance, who does not suffer fools gladly, as you probably have noticed by now, actually was amazed that here it was all about whether or not Tom Homan received some money. Don't know that he did or didn't. And not even asking a question about the Democratic shutdown. And finally he says, here's George, why fewer and fewer people watch your program. And then they cut away because I think he probably said a few other things they didn't want to hear. If that's the way the legacy media is going to cover everything from a government shutdown, which we haven't even talked about yet, what's going on in China, Argentina, there's some big issues there as well. And of course, the peace process, maybe it's just as well you don't spend too much time listening to them. I'm glad you listened to us. When we come back, we're going to talk with Ethan Watson, and then we'll get into some other issues in the news. All that coming up right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, of course, we had Lawrence Jones up just a few minutes ago, and he's, of course, with Fox News. We're going to now talk with Ethan Watson. In between, of course, we've been talking about the peace process and the return of the hostages. Next hour, we're going to get into that in more detail. How did it take place? Maybe some of the behind the scenes. Oh, by the way, we still have a government shutdown, so what does that mean? There's certainly some things we'll be talking about in that regard. We do also know a lot more about the way in which the FBI has been able to obtain some of the phone records of sitting U.S. senators. That's of real concern. And before we're all done, Wall Street Journal did a piece, and I got a commentary coming out on the fact that a lot of people that are marijuana users and then driving in their cars are becoming crash test dummies. So there are just a few topics we will certainly get into, but right now we're going to get into this issue of reshaping America's cultural narrative, and it is written by Ethan Watson. He's been on the program with us. He is part of the Young Voices, and he is an individual that has, first of all, received dual undergraduate degrees in accounting and political science, as well as a master's degree in accounting, all from the University of Kansas. Now he's a law candidate at Arizona State University. Individual that we have a link so that you can find this article that was in American Thinker and a previous one that he wrote about in terms of Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And so, Ethan, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Let's, if we can, talk about first, before we get to the Smithsonian, which is going to be most of our time, just say, are there some lessons we can learn from, and you talk about Cracker Barrel, we could also say Bud Light and a variety of others, but it does seem to me that there has been a push by liberal elites to change the culture, and we see that by, first of all, the kinds of things that are now being taught in the public schools. We see that in some of the corporate images being changed, and yet I see a real significant backlash, and that's one of the reasons you wrote your piece.
Absolutely, and I think the Cracker Barrel Bud Light arena is actually far more important than the Smithsonian. Smithsonian is cool. It's a great museum. It's very entertaining. It's a monument to our civilization, but also most Americans aren't engaging with the Smithsonian every day, but they are going to restaurants like Cracker Barrel. They're, maybe having Bud Light on the weekends. Those are the cultural artifacts that Americans are engaging with every day. And for a long time, there was a big push by liberals to sort of take over these American institutions and make them sort of soft and woke. And it was driven by a kind of dislike of Americana. They view it as chintzy and tacky and, Americans are so dumb and backwards and blah, blah, blah. We've all heard the stereotypes, right? I found that deeply offensive, actually. I mean, America is a proud, hardworking nation that kind of arose out of the wilderness in record time and became a world power. And things as trivial as Cracker Barrel, those are monuments to our civilization because those are embodiments of Americana. And I'm so happy to see President Trump using his bully pulpit in the White House to say, no, actually, let's preserve these monuments to our great civilization, whether it's the lofty Smithsonian or the lowly Cracker Barrel.
One of the things I'm going to hold up right now for those of you watching online are the little booklets we've been making available because we recognize we're coming up to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. If you go to the website right now, we talk about that very significant event and refer to it as restoring America's godly heritage. And so as important as we think that is, I would have to say, as an individual who was around when we had our bicentennial in 1976, there was a great deal of pride in America. There were always the detractors, but very few, and there was a great celebration of America. Now that we're coming to this 250th anniversary, what I see is the possibility there could be some celebration only because Donald Trump is in the office, but more importantly, because there's a question as to whether we now can look at the Smithsonian, we can look at critical race theory, we can look at just critical theory generally, we can see the rise of kind of Marxist ideas, and most history classes today spend a fair amount of time talking about all of America's ills and evils, and we do have some dark chapters in American history, but they never talk about the good things that this country has produced. And so in some respects, we would at least hope that the Smithsonian, which is paid for with our tax dollars, and interesting enough, one of the institutions during the shutdown that is still open, would actually do some things to encourage people to be grateful for America. And yet, as your piece points out, that hasn't exactly been the case, has it?
Oh, absolutely. And if we set aside sort of the moral reasons why the Smithsonian should be pro-American, I mean, obviously that's true. First of all, that America is a great nation, so the Smithsonian should be embodying that. But if we look at it from a purely utilitarian standpoint, the Smithsonian is a public institution. It exists to help the public, help the American public. What is good for America? When we are united, when we are strong. Actually, America is at its best when we are relatively homogenous, not of anything trivial like race, but of culture and values and ideas. We need to be united in those things, and our institutions should promote that unity. But instead, by putting out these ridiculous exhibits, I always laugh, Kerby, at this one Smithsonian exhibit that said that, an element of whiteness to be deconstructed was punctuality and politeness. I mean, that's just absurdly, first of all, kind of racist and just laughable, right? But those kinds of exhibits, those kind of programs, they're anti-unity, right? They make people feel like, oh, either I don't deserve what I have, that's really good, or I can never make it in this country because it's rigged against me. And so even from a practical standpoint, the Smithsonian, by putting out those kinds of content was really harming our country. And for something that's funded by our tax dollars and should be a wonderful monument to our civilization, it's just appalling. And I'm glad President Trump is highlighting that.
And again, I like what you say here. We can point to slavery and decry America's original sin, or we can celebrate the end of slavery and Americans who died to end it. And in each case, we can point to something that obviously the detractors of this country want to point to, but they never point to the fact that we dealt with that and solved that in many cases because of Christian convictions. I mean, whether it's the abolition movement or the temperance movement or the suffrage movement or even later the civil rights movement, so many of these movements were Christian-based and were brought about simply because individuals in that time period recognized certain social ills and evils and did something about it. And that, I think, is something we can celebrate as well, can't we?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you're absolutely right that these Christian values are sort of what solved the slavery problem, but they're really just what makes America and the West in general unique. Right. So it's like I love the slavery example because slavery is a uniquely human evil. Right. It's happened across the world and every part of the world by every group of people. But only the West, America and Europe, kind of informed by their Christian values, was able to stand up and say, no, we're not doing this anymore. We have a moral opposition to this evil practice and we're going to stamp it out. Whether it's the British Empire imposing that across its dominion or the Americans dying in the Civil War, slavery, it's almost our greatest triumph, the way that we were able to crush that evil institution informed by our Christian values. And that's something that we should be celebrating and not hanging our heads in shame over, I think.
And again, while we're talking about Christian ideas, here's one nation under God. Here's the Bill of Rights. Here's one on the Federalist Papers. Here's one on Constitution interpretation. Here's one on the Patriot Preachers. Now, whether or not you had a jurisprudence class there at your college, Arizona State, or not, it is very clear that many of the laws in this country, many of the social forms and cultural ideas came from Christian ideas. And so it is important for us to recapture and restore those ideas because we have people on the other side that want to reshape America according to kind of a Marxist or cultural, almost atheistic kind of narrative. Is that true?
No, absolutely. And this really touches on something. I used to be like, when I was in high school, early college, I was very libertarian. I was like, hey man, you shouldn't legislate morality, just let everyone do what they want. But I've come to realize that that worldview doesn't work, because if you don't set the standards, if you don't use legitimate power to sort of create the government that you want, create the culture that you want, someone else is going to step in and do that for you. And that's how you wind up with pride flags being flown at city halls. That's how you wind up with these activist judges. That's how you wind up with all of these ills that are making our society worse. And so all laws are a reflection of morality, and I think it's up to us to sort of pick the morality that we want to inform our laws. And well, if I'm picking, I'm going to pick the one that sort of this country was founded on and made this country a force to be reckoned with. And by the way, that stamped out the evils of slavery and sort of pagan practices practiced by Native Americans and all sorts of these sort of um, bad ways to live, replaced by a Christian nation. That's all very good, and we should remember that that was what we were founded on.
Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back. We'll continue our conversation with Ethan Watson. Let me just mention that sometimes people say, I'm really concerned about the future of this country. You've heard from Lawrence Jones. You've heard from Ethan Watson. With these kind of individuals leading in the future, I'm pretty optimistic. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Ethan Watson with us for a few more minutes. The title of your article, of course, is Cracker Barrel, the Smithsonian, and the question Gen Z needs to answer. And I thought we might focus on that last piece for just a minute because, Ethan, as you may know, we, of course, have a next generation roundtable where we gather together younger individuals. I get to watch. I'm not even a participant in that. But in addition to that, we have the Know Why podcast that Liberty does. We have a Point of View highlights podcast that's on Spotify. We also are developing an app so that people, young people especially, your generation, to actually be able to listen to this program or those podcasts. It does seem to me that we need to do more of these kinds of things that we're trying to do here at Point of View if we're going to educate the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely, Kerby. And I think this is the key question facing my generation. What is an American, and is that something we should be proud to be? And I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. My generation has access to the entire wealth of human knowledge in their pockets at all times. They can find things out for themselves. Now, there's all sorts of issues with misinformation and social media, but it's also leading my generation to sort of explore narratives and historical events in a way that maybe the public education system didn't teach them. I mean, I've certainly done that, looking into sort of the history of Christianity, the history of the pioneers. I've been learning about that on my own because I'm able to in a way that maybe prior generations weren't. And couple that with a curiosity in religion exhibited by my generation, shown by our return to church. I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful that Gen Z is going to say, yes, it is good that America was founded, and I am happy to be an American. But you're right, we need to keep reaching out. We need to keep advocating for Gen Zers and encouraging them to take pride in their country. And I think my generation is very fatigued with sort of that mealy-mouthed liberal worldview where, it's all oppressor-oppressed matrices and the rest. I think my generation is growing very tired of that because it's not productive. It's not accurate, and it also just makes for a really bland culture. And I think my generation is really craving a revitalization of religion and national identity.
You also illustrated something that I talk about, and that is when Marlon Maddox started this program 53 years ago, he was trying to provide a voice that people could not hear. There was almost sort of a secular humanistic filibuster going on, and he wanted to provide an alternative. While that's still true, and there are things that we talk about that the mainstream press will never cover, there's a different issue that those of you in Gen Y and Gen Z are facing, and that is there's too much information, and we don't know who to trust. We don't know which are trusted resources. So one of the reasons we want to develop this app so that you can carry it in your phone is somebody says, well, wait a minute, I don't know that I really think that the founders were Christian. You say, well, wait just a minute. Let me go to pointofview.net here. Okay, look at this. Here's some facts. Here's some articles. Here's an interview we did with an individual that has reputable academic credentials to show that most of the founders did have a theistic worldview. Not all were Christians, certainly not. And when you come down to these issues about whether or not America's history is just one dark chapter after another, you have some alternatives. So it does seem to me that those are some things that we really want to put in your hands, in the hands of other listeners, some of whom maybe aren't even listening on the radio, but they may listen to us on some of those podcasts.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's great that Point of View is doing that kind of work. I think that's super important. But I also want to highlight a different path maybe to getting to where I got, because stats and records and academics and credentials can influence a lot. But what really led me to sort of being firm in my conviction that, Christianity is the correct way, that sort of America is a good thing that exists, and I'm going to say that without qualification. I had to sort of look inward. I think you can get kind of caught up in the statistics and the accounts and the nuances. But when you take a step back and look broadly, you say, what has worked? What has produced human prosperity? What has made people happy? What has made people wealthier and safer and healthier? And it's the way America was ran for most of its history. Right now it's been a building process, but Christian values and American patriotism, hard work, individualism, capitalism, across the board, those are the things that make people happy. I think most people understand that. when they take a step back from the stats and the screeching blue-haired professors at Ivy League institutions. I think when you step back from that, you can really see that, it's almost intuitive that this is the way. And so I think the way Turning Point is doing it with the app, that's good, that's valuable. We need that. That reaches some people. But some people, just ask them honestly, like, do you think this is working? Or should we go back to the way we used to do it?
That's right. And again, we've oftentimes said there's like a three-legged stool. You have a republic that was established so that we would have a limited government, and that would allow for the greatest amount of freedom politically. We have a free market system, which has been somewhat corrupted, but one that allows for the greatest amount of economic freedom. And then we have a Judeo-Christian foundation. It's kind of like a three-legged stool. And as you said, anybody that's really open to looking at history at all recognizes what has led to flourishing, and it has happened because we've had the greatest amount of political freedom, economic freedom, but undergirded with some kind of moral principle. And so if you want that for the future, as you said, you can look back in history and even look around currently and see what doesn't work and what should be working, and that is something that I think could be very helpful as a very compelling vision in the future. But Ethan, if we can support you in some way, I would want to do so. So I would encourage, first of all, people to pray for you. And second of all, to get this article, because it is very well written. And it is one that if some of our listeners have children, or let's be honest, even grandchildren that are Generation Y or Z, you could say, look, you're only going to need about a couple of minutes to read this by an individual that's obviously thought through some of these issues, and as a result, wants you to begin to recognize that maybe we need to reshape the cultural narrative that we have right now. But I hope we can also continue following you, because you're a high achiever for sure, and I'm just really thrilled by the fact that you are one of the many very strong voices through the Young Voices ministry that is there, the organization, and so people can find out more about you as well. And let's keep in touch, and let's get you back on the program in the future.
Oh, absolutely. You're too kind. And thank you so much for the opportunity. Always a pleasure.
Ethan Watson. And again, you can find out more about him by going to the website. And if you do so, some of you might say, well, I'd like to interact with him. Well, we've got a link to his X, and you can see what he's posted there. We've posted one of his articles from American Thinker. If you click on another one, you'll see his previous article. And there are many other opportunities for you to learn from him. One of those rising stars. We want to try to let you know there are a lot of people out there that are understanding where this culture is going, and they want to, in a sense, come back to the theme that we talk about so often, and that is restoring America's godly heritage. That's one of the things we've mentioned before. Those of you watching online might know that we've been making these booklets available to, we call it the Patriot Pack, for anybody that's a first-time donor. Even though we're no longer doing Truth Team, I think the offer would still be okay. I don't think anybody would get upset with me for offering this today, and if so, I'll pay for it, because I think these are the kinds of things I'd want to put in the hands of young people that maybe need to know a little bit more about history. And if all you know about history is what you're getting from some of these woke Smithsonian displays and exhibits, or what you know is from some of the public schools, you might want to consider an alternative, and we certainly want to provide that alternative here at Point of View. We come back. I want to come back to this issue of the hostages, the peace process. How did we happen? What happened? Can we maintain that? And we'll get into some other issues. After all, we still have a government shutdown. What is it, 13th day? And counting. All that coming up right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, hostages are home and the peace process begins. How long it will last, we'll get into those details. And if you have a comment or a question, let's open up the phones in the second hour, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join the conversation, I think most of you just want to sit back and kind of hear some of the information that I've been able to dig up. Let me give credit as where credit is due. One of the articles we've posted is by Noah Rothman, one by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, which I've yet to read, and also one by Jim Garrity as well. Some great material, and you can find much of it on the website, or certainly do even any kind of search to find that. But let me come back to where we are with Hamas. That's the big question right now, okay? Hostages are home. Unfortunately, many of the bodies are returning as well. But I think this particular piece out of the New Yorker is helpful, in which the author was saying, I think Hamas has been willing to make a deal to release the hostages, to release all of them, but in return for some kind of assurance of the end of the war. And certainly that is the case. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, Noah Rothman points out that we are in a much different set of circumstances than we were October 6th, 2023. And that is because of the decimation of Hamas, Hezbollah, even Iran, and that is the case. So one of the authors here said, well, the calculations for Hamas have changed. Why? Because Hamas is a much weaker entity than it was then. When Donald Trump put forward his plan, and I want to go into some of the details, because he had a 20-point plan, and it was pretty much Donald Trump. It was vintage Donald Trump, really asking for more than maybe he even thought he would get. You know, you've ever read the book, The Art of the Deal, or if you've even watched him at all, you know that he'll ask for some things that really are pretty much outrageous, and then the fallback position is probably what he wanted. In this case, when he put forward his plan, it was very lopsided. But here's the thing I don't think Hamas really expected to happen, and that is many of these Arab states actually went along with this. I will mention those names again in case you'd like to hear them or write them down. And so as a result, they embraced the peace plan put forward by Donald Trump, maybe not because they really liked it, not because they thought it was even fair, but because I think there are just a lot of countries in the Middle East that would like this to be over. And so this put Hamas in a very difficult position. The original thought, I think, in their minds was, we will attack Israel. It will spark an international conflict. All the nations of the world will come down on Israel as they retaliate, and thus we will be able to maybe rid the land of these Jews. I mean, you can see how foolhardy that was, but nevertheless, I think maybe that was their idea. And instead, Hamas now had to say, well, if they were to accept the plan as it was laid out, basically, it's just almost unconditional surrender. They're supposed to hand over their weapons. Gaza is going to be controlled indefinitely by Israeli army, the IDF, and maybe by certain international forces of some sort, and maybe even overseen by what are being called an international trustee ship, headed by Donald Trump. Remember, he'd like to develop Hamas, Gaza without Hamas into something that looks more like, Monaco or something like that. And this is really not something that any of the Palestinians or the Gazans would accept, but they were in such a bind, they sort of had to go along with that as well. And so one of the key issues in the 20-point plan by Donald Trump was position number 13. And just for the benefit of those of you that would have difficulty finding that and digging it out, let me read it. It says Hamas and other factions agree to not have any role in the government of Gaza, directly or indirectly in any form. Any military, terror, or offensive infrastructure, including tunnels, weapons, production facilities, will be destroyed and not be rebuilt. There will be a process of demilitarization of Gaza under the supervision of independent monitors, which will include placing weapons permanently beyond use through an agreed process of decommissioning and supported by an international funded buyback and reintegration program, all verified by independent monitors. New Gaza will be fully committed to building a prosperous economy and to peaceful coexistence with its neighbors. Now, if indeed Donald Trump, or even later on, whoever replaces Donald Trump as the next president, is able to keep that going, as some jokingly said, maybe we should give Trump one peace prize and the next president another peace prize, because we know, as I've said before, that Hamas has routinely broken various ceasefires. But Hamas is not the Hamas that existed October 6, 2023. Are you with me on that? Just before we move on, let me just take on one thing, just maybe to make you smile or make you shake your head. I'll leave it to you to figure out your reaction. But just as this was unfolding, you have the Secretary of State under Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, rushing to the front of the stage, really saying, well, this whole plan was a foundation from the Biden administration, and as a result, the Trump administration's getting credit for what the Biden administration did. And Jim Garrity said, seeing Antony Blinken rushing on the stage reminded me of Kanye West rushing on the stage when Taylor Swift was receiving an award. Remember that? And I'm going to let you finish, but this is just, as one wag said, if there is any previous foundation, and much of this developed, and we'll talk about this probably more tomorrow, because it's a very good piece I've posted on a 10-point assessment of how this took place, but it's almost worth discussing tomorrow. But one person on X said this: if there was any previous foundation, it would have been Trump 45, the first Trump administration, and the Abraham Accords. And then, of course, this was escalated in large part by the destruction of the leadership of Hamas, Hezbollah, and even the threats from Iran. So, nevertheless, some attempts right now to take credit. And again, if Joe Biden's former staff and cabinet want to take some credit, fine, you can take credit. I think we all know who is going to benefit from this. The Israeli people. Who's going to get the most credit for this? Donald Trump, and maybe even Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Not to mention, of course, as we just pointed out a minute ago, some people that we always thought might not necessarily be up to the task. Nevertheless, we have some individuals that have been able to make this happen in a way that's pretty surprising and encouraging. And so whether you talk about Steve Witkoff, special presidential envoy, or Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, I think they deserve a great deal of credit as well. We come back, though, just real briefly, just a couple real quick comments about some of the governments that are supporting this peace process. When you have lots of Muslim governments supporting the peace process against Hamas, I think you can understand why we have the possibility of peace in the Middle East. We'll talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Americans are starting to realize how much privacy they are losing. It isn't just the government through surveillance that is invading our privacy. Major corporations are collecting information on us, even when we aren't sharing it online. Here's a classic example of that. 20 years ago, the Target Corporation was able to conclude that a shopper was pregnant and even estimate her due date. The story was written up in the New York Times and has become a classic example of targeted marketing. A data scientist at Target began to analyze this massive database that Target stores were amassing from the purchases of their customers. He began to mine the data and discovered a few interesting things about Target customers. He discovered, for example, that pregnant women are more likely to buy unscented lotion and that they start doing this at the beginning of their second trimester. This correlation between pregnancy and changes in shopping behavior was one of the 24 data points he and other analysts were able to identify. When they combined all these correlations together, they were able to establish a pregnancy prediction score. This score told them two things. First, that the female consumer was pregnant. Second, it also gave them a good estimate of her due date. The value to Target was considerable. They were able to send coupons to the woman during different times in her pregnancy so that they would arrive when she was most likely to need them. The timing of the coupons brought more pregnant women into the Target stores to use them. You know, this marketing success story illustrates how big data and sophisticated data analysis can invade your privacy without you providing any information. Whether you click on a link online or buy a product in the store, somebody is watching. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just a few more comments real quickly about the peace process, which is ongoing. And that is, as I mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning again, you have, as this particular article by Noah Rothman points out, Muslim governments as diverse as those of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates committed to supporting this document being finalized in Egypt today. And I think it really is very significant. And if nothing else, one of the other pieces by Noah Rothman is, he says, the only reason there's space for something new to emerge from the catastrophe that took place on October 7th is that Israel fought this war with the goal of securing not a temporary reprieve from Islamic terror, but victory over its attackers. He says Westerners are unfamiliar with what it looks like to fight a war to win. That's a pretty good line there as well. And Israel will emerge from this war the regional military hegemon, and the Middle East Sunni Arab states will probably proceed with the normalization process that the war merely interrupted. So there is some reason for hope, but we also have to recognize what Hamas is known for doing, but it is a shadow of its former self. Let me just real quickly mention this piece that came out today by the editors of National Review. For those of you watching online, it's got a picture of Donald Trump shaking hands with Benjamin Netanyahu. By the way, we'll be watching this election in New York City, but if indeed Zoran Mamdani is elected as mayor, he already has said that if Benjamin Netanyahu comes to speak to the United Nations or is in New York City, he'll have him arrested as a war criminal. So you can see that nevertheless, some of this has not necessarily cooled the hatred for him or for Israel or for the Israeli-Gaza war. But at least the editors put it this way: barbarism didn't win. For more than 2 years, Hamas clung to the people it had taken hostage and brutalized as leverage over Israel in the war that the terror group initiated October 7th, 2023. Men, women, and children, Israeli foreign nationals, Jews, and non-Jews alike. They do spend some time, of course, talking about the hostages, but they also remind us of some of the protests, and it's worth a mention. I won't even get into it tomorrow, but it is worth a mention that he said those in the West who raged at the sight of posters, these would be the posters of hostages, featuring the captive faces, didn't want to believe it. They told themselves that Israel invited the atrocities to which civilians were subjected and that its government sought to engineer a genocide of the Palestinian people. They tore up and defaced the images that confronted them with the gravity of their moral inversion. Their credibility and cowardice stand in stark relief against the moral clarity that undergirded today's triumph. And then goes on to not only talk about those who protested from the river to the sea and supported Hamas, but then talks about many of the governments. A little bit later, they say, far too many can count themselves among the fearful, weak, and vacillating. Governments in London, Paris, Madrid, Ottawa, Canberra, and elsewhere lend credence to the lies promulgated by Israel's pathological opponents. They convinced themselves that they could supplicate their way to a resolution of the ancient enmities that sparked this conflict. As they applaud a victory in which they did not contribute, perhaps they might feel a fleeting sense of shame for their conduct. I doubt it. If the past is any guide, they will persist in the errors beginning tomorrow. And so again, they take some time not only to celebrate the return of the hostages, but also remind some of us that quickly will forget that some of this was happening on the streets of America, and there weren't a lot of people that were very supportive of Israel, but fortunately this president was, and the administration was, and as we'll point out tomorrow, very good piece, the pieces of Trump's piece, 10 points that I think illustrate why this took place, and I think it's worthy of some significant time. We'll work our way through all 10 of those, putting that on the piece for tomorrow, our Tuesday program. But before we take a break, I think it is at least worth a mention that we have a government shutdown. Have you noticed? This is just amazing to me. And again, a quote again from Jim Garrity, this is the 13th day of the federal government shutdown. And not only is it not the top news story of the week, hostages being released and the prospect of something resembling peace in the Middle East will do that, there is no indication that either side in Washington is eager to start up negotiations again. And so you have to start looking at the calendar here because, again, if you're not familiar, this is Columbus Day, so, of course, nothing's going on in the government, not in the banks, not in the post office, anywhere. But tomorrow, the Senate is back in session. Well, what's going on with the House? Well, back in September 19th, they passed what's called a clean continuing resolution. And so the House is in recess till October 19th. So that's 6 days from now. Realistically, that's not really going to happen even until next week from Tuesday. And so it's really up to the Senate. What is the Senate going to do? And I suspect the Senate is not going to do anything. But here's the issue. The federal government workers will get paid, but not the next paycheck. And so that begins to be a problem. The assumption always was if we close down the government, then indeed there will be enough pain that there will be voters forcing their members of Congress to continue to keep the government open. I've written a commentary which will air next week, and I wrote it saying, well, as I write it, the government is shut down, but I'm hoping by the time it airs, the government will no longer be shut down. And I even suggest something that we are going to now put up for our take action item so that we can maybe actually avoid these shutdowns ever again. But nevertheless, federal government workers aren't getting paid. So look at this. While most civilian federal employees are expected to get their paychecks sometime in the next few days, they'll only take home the pay they earned up until the shutdown began. Regardless of whether they are accepted or furloughed, federal employees will not be paid for any days working between October 1st and October 4th. Well, that's 4 days, but that's still part of a few days of a 2-week pay period. It's also the last paycheck accepted and furloughed employees will receive till a government shutdown ends, and the first fully missed paycheck, if indeed shutdown continues, will be for pay from October 5th through October 18th, which is, of course, 5 days from now. Only federal employees who are considered exempt from the shutdown will continue to be paid as usual, which raises a very important question. And again, I'll quote Jim Garrity. So we're left with the big question that are glaringly obvious before the shutdown began. How much financial hardship are federal workers, an overwhelmingly Democratic voting constituency, willing to endure so that Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats can appear to be fighting against the administration? Again, look at the calendar. The House will not get together till about a week from tomorrow, and don't plan on passing another continuing resolution. Don't plan on having a discussion about that continuing resolution. Certainly aren't going to consider whether or not to refund all sorts of aspects of the government that have already been defunded. And so the real question is, will the Senate, when it is back in session tomorrow, finally say, okay, we've proven our point, but if we don't end this soon, there are going to be a lot of federal workers who are going to be, first of all, upset that they didn't get 4 days of their 2-week paycheck, but more importantly, won't get any paycheck the next time it comes out. And so you can see that the pressure begins to mount, I suspect, on the Democrats, but we will see. If nothing else, it is a reminder that we live in very interesting times. And one of the reasons why I would encourage you to go to our website today, our Take Action is one we've been talking about for about 2 weeks, but it is having to do with the issue of whether or not we should protect children under the age of 18 who are oftentimes being forced into gender reassignment surgery. But that one we're going to replace pretty quickly with one that we are putting together right now to talk about a piece of legislation that has been introduced by 2 individuals that have actually been on this program with us to actually prevent this kind of insanity, this kind of clown show from happening again. So let's take a break. Let's get into some other issues in the news. There are many. We'll talk about that right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net, click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour today, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about this issue of privacy. I might mention that if you receive the various commentaries that I produce and Penna Dexter produces, that you will see the one today talking about privacy and security, really privacy and marketing. And interestingly enough, that one is one that we mailed out. If you do go to the website right now, the one that is there says privacy and marketing is not the correct one. So even though it has that title, it's not the accurate one. But if you receive the one that we have been talking about on the air and went out to all the radio stations, as well as the one on the email, I point out that there is a lot of loss of privacy that we are dealing with. And part of that has to do with the fact that because companies have massive databases, as a result, I use the example of Target because that was a piece that appeared in the New York Times about how the databases that Target used helped them to begin to figure out, for example, when an individual might likely be pregnant based simply on the kinds of products they were purchasing. And I thought it was really interesting that it was so significant that at one point there was a father that was upset about the fact that they were sending pregnancy notices to his daughter and then found out, well, they knew she was pregnant before he did. And so it illustrates again that whether you're clicking on a product, buying a product or whatever, we are dealing with, of course, a very new world in terms of privacy. And I think we've sort of come to expect that. If you go to Amazon and you purchase a particular item, guess what? All sorts of other items show up on your email, and we sort of recognize that. But it also brings me to something else, and that is the amount of privacy that we are losing because of the federal government. And this particular article has to do with the FBI Senate phone records and January 6th, because as the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out, President Trump's opponents often act as his biggest enablers, and now comes news that President Biden's FBI went so far in its investigation of the Capitol riot as to obtain telephone records of 9 Republicans in Congress. And that came because of requests that came from the former special counsel, Jack Smith. They said he's going to have some explaining to do. And let's hear from Democrats and media who now want to stop the lawfare spiral. This is, again, a revelation that came from Senator Chuck Grassley's inquiry into the FBI's what's called Arctic Frost investigation. Now, the Bureau's documents actually were able to show that an FBI agent analyzed phone records for Representative Mike Kelly, as well as for Republican Senators Lindsey Graham, Bill Hagerty, Josh Hawley, Dan Sullivan, Tommy Tuberville, Ron Johnson, Cynthia Lummis, and Marsha Blackburn. And the research done by Senator Chuck Grassley found that the FBI record request was approved by a grand jury. And according to his office, the data obtained ran from January 4th to January 7th, 2021. And this does not indicate the contents of any phone conversations, but it does show who called whom, when, and for how long. And again, Chuck Grassley said there's no predicate that we can find for the solicitation of these telephone records. He said, which I think emphasized the political weaponization that was behind all of this effort. And we're still getting more information. Well, again, one of the things that was so interesting is Senator Ron Johnson called it a fishing expedition and a blatant political persecution. If you start looking at the timeline of, again, the work being done by Jack Smith against Donald Trump for trying to overturn the 2020 election, that indictment came in August 2023. This FBI document describing a preliminary toll analysis of Republican lawmakers is dated September 27th, 2023. And so, again, when you're talking about Senators Ron Johnson and Chuck Grassley, they were prominent in investigating the excesses of the Justice Department and the FBI against Donald Trump in the 2016 election and his first term. before I go on, let's just be honest about the fact that a lot of this was happening when you were talking about candidate Donald Trump before his election in 2016, even more going on in 2020 and 2021, and continued on under the Biden administration. Again, ask yourself a fundamental question. If the roles were reversed and there were questions about something done by Barack Obama, by Joe Biden, and the Republicans had a special counsel that was subpoena all of the records and obtaining all the records of Democratic senators. Do you think it would maybe be front page in the Washington Post and the New York Times? Of course it would be. I posted this article because it wasn't even necessarily front page in National Review, but it illustrates again just the incredible loss of privacy. If you've listened to this program any length of time, I've pointed out that if you can do this to the President of the United States, they can do it to you. If they can do it to U.S. senators, Republican senators, they can do it to you. So sometimes there's a tendency to sit back and say, well, I'm not a Republican, or I'm not a senator, I'm certainly not president, I don't care. But I think it shows how this weaponization has metastasized in ways that should concern us. Anyway, let's go back to the rest of this article before we take a break. Jack Smith's indictment explained how Donald Trump and his aides tried to hack the Electoral College on January 6th. I think that's, first of all, not right, but that's how he said it, by submitting fraudulent electors and pressuring the presiding officer, which at that time was, of course, Vice President Mike Pence, to accept or reject Joe Biden's electors. This is happening, which really, again, a strain on all of that, but we'll leave that aside because that was part of that. The indictment then alleges that on the morning of January 6th, an agent of Mr. Trump's contacted a U.S. senator to hand him a hand-delivered document to the vice president, specifically the certificates of the fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which are believed not to have been delivered to the vice president or the archivist by mail. And according to Mike Pence's aides, they rejected the delivery. So, end of discussion, you would think. But that became, if you will, the justification for then subpoenaing all of the records of these U.S. senators. These are sitting U.S. senators. And again, even as you look down that list, Lindsey Graham, Bill Hagerty, Cynthia Lummis, Marsha Blackburn, why are they even on the list? But okay. But it isn't far-fetched to think that the FBI might just have been trolling for evidence to charge one or more Republican lawmakers with obstruction or another crime. So this was, I think, as many people have seen it, as a fishing expedition, and where there's a historic precedent for alternative slates of electors, as the law recognized, even if Trump's attempt to, as they say, hijack the idea to stay in power was terrible. Can a lawmaker even, quote, obstruct a congressional proceeding in which he is a participant? I mean, just think this through for just a minute. You are using a really flimsy argument to get some kind of indictment, or at least some kind of permission to then pull together all of those records. And as he said, imagine if Jack Smith had indicted a couple of Republican senators. Perhaps he figured Trump would lose the election. Instead, it helped Mr. Trump win the election in, of course, most recently, 2024. Well, it's a good piece to just remind us of something we say so often, and that is we have to understand that we don't have the expectation of privacy that we would have expected. You would assume that when you make a phone call to someone else, that that's a private phone call, and you would be wrong. You would assume that when you go in, as I point out in my commentary, purchase a product, it wouldn't be then sent all the way through the internet so that everybody else could see what you purchased and thus use that to try to sell you some other products. As much as we like the convenience of that, there are times when I buy a book at Barnes & Noble and my receipt says, well, if you like these books, you might like those books too. And I go, Hadn't thought about those books. Okay, I might have to come back to the register. I think I found another book. I like the convenience, but it's just a reminder that we don't have privacy. But this article reminds us that even U.S. senators don't have a lot of privacy, and a pretty flimsy justification was used to actually obtain their phone records. If they can do it to senators, probably can do it to you. I'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that I've said it before, but it's worth mentioning again, that just as governments, state and even federal governments, are rushing to legalize and thus increase the use of marijuana, we're learning more about its dangers. And I can remember years ago, and this is many years ago, I had a former New York Times reporter on the program talking about a link between cannabis and schizophrenia. And I remember at the time, the pushback was very significant. First of all, I had people call in and say, look, I've been smoking weed all my life and I don't have schizophrenia. And I said, well, that's not the point. The point is you see a correlation, and it does seem to be more significant. And whereas that might have been controversial, say, 5, 8, 10 years ago, I can't even remember how long that was, you now have the National Institutes of Health talking about the same connection. But the bigger issue is public safety. And I've done a commentary last year on the number of individuals that maybe pass a drug test, but then start using marijuana on the job and don't get caught. Well, this latest article comes out from the Wall Street Journal, in which they're quoting researchers at Wright State University. Here's what the editors of the Wall Street Journal say: how much social and public health damage will Americans suffer before doing a U-turn on marijuana promotion? A new study finds that more than 40% of drivers who died in car accidents in one U.S. county over the last 6 years had elevated levels of drug in their blood. Okay, let's get more specific here. The research done at Wright State University analyzed driver autopsies. Okay, so these are individuals, of course, who died, and these were in car crashes in Ohio between January 2019 and September 2024. And again, more than 4 in 10 tested positive for THC, which, of course, is pot's psychoactive ingredient, with an average level of 30.7 nanograms. Now, again, as I was writing this last week, had a chance to chat with a person that works in law enforcement, and again, helped me understand a few things. That level, as the article points out, is 6 times the level most states use to define impairment. What's the problem? Why can't we catch those people? Well, breathalyzers won't usually detect recent marijuana use, which really makes it very hard for police to nab anybody who might be driving high. And I also have, in some of my commentaries in the past, pointed out that the marijuana that existed when I was growing up in Berkeley, California, is 5 times more potent than it was back then, and so is having a much more significant effect than it did, for example, on some of the baby boomers back then in the 60s that got high. Well, what do we see numbers-wise? Well, we first of all see that auto fatalities have increased over the last decade, even as cars have become safer and as alcohol consumption has fallen. The question that is being asked by the editors of the Wall Street Journal is, could marijuana be contributing to more reckless driving? They say that's a fair question. Nearly a quarter of 18 to 25-year-olds used marijuana in the last month, according to the most recent survey. 1/4, just think that through, as did 15% of those 26 years or older. So the point they're making is that we do understand that this could be a potential danger. And as we've pointed out before, if you can't really detect it, and you are recognizing that we are now having a pretty significant analysis of driver autopsies from car crashes, in which nearly half, more than 4 in 10, test positive at an average level of 30 nanograms, which again is 6 times the level most states use to define impairment, there's something going on. So they go on to say that this particular study, which is being presented this week at the American College of Surgeons Conference, ought to prompt the Trump administration to slam the brakes on the mooted plan to move marijuana to a less risky level on the federal drug schedule. That's a move could cultivate the belief that marijuana isn't all that harmful, despite, as they say, reams of evidence to the contrary. Now, I'm willing to have an open conversation about that. That's what we tried to do years ago. It went okay, but it had a lot of people pushing back. But if you want to form a policy, I think you have to consider both the pros and cons. And the pros almost always are, well, people are going to use it anyway. Yeah, people also are going to use alcohol anyway, but that doesn't make drunk driving necessarily a good idea either. Or, well, we can't control the drug, can't control drug coming across our borders or even being grown. Yeah, we can begin to think about whether or not there are some policies that need to be implemented that are going to make that a little bit safer. And if anything, the argument usually gets down to, well, if we don't legalize marijuana, it's going to just make it illegal, and it's just going to have the illegal market explode. Well, interesting enough, the editors of the Wall Street Journal remind us that California officials last month said they destroyed more than 20,000 illegal cannabis plants at operations run by transnational criminal operations. They also found firearms and hazardous pesticides that contaminate the environment. And the state wildlife official said when criminals steal or destroy the national resources that support California's extraordinary biodiversity, we are committed to stopping them. And so the argument being made by the editors is, wouldn't it be nice if progressives warned pot users about doing damage to themselves? What the country needs is a group called Mothers Against Drugged Driving. Certainly we are disturbed and upset about individuals that are driving drunk. We should be concerned equally about people driving high. And this is just one more example of how this has become a very significant issue. And just as there seems to always be a rush to do what we can to legalize, in this case, marijuana, without a serious question about the pros and cons, the number of cons, if you put out a piece of paper and put a line down it, the number of cons on the right-hand side are mounting up pretty significantly. And legislators need to really reevaluate whether the pros on the left side are even worth it given the cons on the right side. So again, we give you that article to look at, and I was certainly encouraged that the editors of the Wall Street Journal, which tend to be more on the libertarian side anyway, are willing to address that issue. And you might also want to look up the original study, which was done by the Wright State University, presented this week to the American College of Surgeons Conference, and maybe a consideration that this administration and other state governments need to evaluate in light of what we now know after, in many cases, the legalization of marijuana in certain states. It's been a social experiment. Hasn't turned out quite the way I think some people expected it to turn out. Anyway, that's all we have for today. If you find yourself saying, you've covered a lot of topics, I'd like to read them for myself. We have those available on the website at pointofview.net. Take the time to read them. Maybe print them out, pass them on to others, or forward them to others. I think this is a way you can extend the reach of Point of View. I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. As you go to the website, again, if you'd like to find some of those articles, my viewpoints commentary, or even listen to some of the podcast, it's all available at Point of View. And we'll see you tomorrow on Tuesday's Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.